So in the last video, this is where we stopped talking about the rhetorical canon. Today we are going to pick that up and start talking about invention. So reminder, this is just starting your speech, developing it, researching it, and to some degree picking your topic was also part of that. So when we focus on today's lesson, I'm going to be talking about two things. One is researching your speech. The other thing is balancing out the research material with non-factual sources, which I'll talk about later. So when I talk about researching your speech, I kind of also like to title this, How Not to Wikipedia Everything, because students love to use Wikipedia. You cannot, I'll emphasize that again, you cannot use Wikipedia, so please keep that in mind. There are a lot of other really good resources that you can use, however. So I'm going to have some requirements, and this will be for every speech that we do. You will have to have internet sources or non-internet sources that meet these criteria. So the first criteria, it has to be scholarly material. So this is something that's peer-reviewed, this is something that has been published like a book, right? There's been some sort of vetting process, it comes from a database. Reputable sources. So not all good sources have to be scholarly. There's a lot of good material out there that, while it's not scholarly, has some credibility. We'll talk about how to identify that. Non-biased, it's really important that you have information that doesn't have a particular agenda that it's trying to sell you. And then, of course, it's current. So with scholarly sources, one thing that I would recommend is using the library. A lot of students neglect to actually utilize this as a resource. You're already paying for it, so to be honest, you should be using it, but there's actually a lot of really great material. So I'm going to talk about how to utilize this. There are two ways first to actually get to it. So if you're on campus, you can just click on library and get there. However, if you're not on campus, you can actually use PantherWeb to get in through it. So once you actually get to the website, so go to palmbeachstate.edu, you're going to click on PantherWeb. Otherwise, if you're on campus, you click on the library. Once you get into PantherWeb, you see that little icon right there on the bottom with quick links. You'll click on the library and then go to databases. So this is where you're going to be able to find all the material that you are going to need. And when you go in there, I typically recommend starting with a generic search like academic one file, academic search. I've clicked global warming here as an example, and now it's going to pull up a lot of different sources for you that are really, really effective, really, really credible sources. Now, in addition to the generic academic file searches, you can also go to specific searches, and these are listed under there if you scroll down like you saw earlier. So this is an example. This is biography and context. You can find a lot of different information about specific people. So if you're trying to pinpoint a search, opposing viewpoints is especially going to be helpful when we get into the persuasive and argumentative speeches. There's also a lot of other different databases that you can use, not just for this class, but classes in general. So if you have topics, for instance, that are on health and wellness, or you have other topics, for instance, maybe on literature, or topics that are science related, topics that are maybe based on art, right? Any of these, and like I said, this is not just for this class, but any class. So go to the Palm Beach State website, go through PantherWeb, and you will be able to find this. Next, we need to talk about reputable sources. So, like I said before, reputable sources are not scholarly, right? They're not something that's a book, they're not something that's a journal, something that comes from a database. What it would be instead is something that you can find that still has some level of credibility, right? Maybe from an association that has credibility, an individual who has credibility on the topic. So let me give you an example. If you're doing a speech on cancer, the American Cancer Society would be a really obvious choice, right? They have credibility, they're an organization that we can trust, as opposed to Planet Cancer. And this was something I found when I was just Googling the word cancer. This is more of a personal sort of blog. That's something you obviously want to avoid. Another example, so let's say you're doing a health-related topic, the Mayo Clinic is a really, really obvious one. They're very, very credible, as opposed to something like How Stuff Works. Now, How Stuff Works can be a great resource if you're trying to find out something on the internet on how to do something or how to figure out how something actually works. And I'm not saying that the information that they have right here on exercise would actually be wrong, but they don't offer the same level of credibility as the Mayo Clinic, so you want to try and avoid them as a source. Another thing, it can't be biased. So like I said earlier, this is especially important for this speech because we are doing a speech that is supposed to be educational in nature. It's not supposed to persuade the audience, so your sources have to reflect that. So to give you an example, if you're doing a speech, say, on gun control, which is already a controversial topic, the NRA, the National Rifle Association, is something you should avoid. And at the same time, too, the Brady campaign, which basically has the opposite agenda of the NRA, should also be avoided, right? These are both sources that have specific agendas. They are trying to persuade you. You automatically want to nix these out of your possible pool of sources that you could use. And then the last thing, it needs to be current. Now this is a tough one. Typically the rule of thumb is about 5 to 10 years means something is current. However, that's going to change if we're talking about, say, something technological. 10 years is like 100 years when we're talking about technology. Things change so quickly. So for that, maybe 3 years, 2 years is really current. But if we're talking about something that doesn't really change, the 5 to 10 year rule doesn't really apply. So for instance, with Shakespeare, information about where he grew up or interpretations of Romeo and Juliet aren't going to vastly change in 10 to 5 years. So when I say current, it's really important that you use your judgment here. If it's something that's, say, scientific, technical, medical, it really does need to be 5 years or even less than that. And if it's something that maybe is more historical, that we haven't had new discoveries on, something literature related, art related, or other things that aren't going to change, then, older than 10 years most likely is fine. If you ever get confused on this, feel free to ask me, but like I said, just use good judgment. The other thing we need to focus on is what you don't want to do in internet research. So there's a lot of good material out there. Some of the things that I just showed you are really good resources, but I'm going to emphasize this again, don't use Wikipedia. So a couple of things that you don't want to use. Using encyclopedias in general, these used to be popular, right? Students no longer use those, but any sort of online encyclopedia is something you want to avoid. Thinking that because it's on the internet it counts as research. So if it doesn't meet those criteria, it's not going to count as a source. That the internet equals truth. A large majority of what is on the internet is completely false, and that's been proven by research time and time again. So make sure that you are checking your sources, and that's why I really want you to go to credible, reputable material, because you can find a lot of stuff that is completely off. And I've actually had students who have done speeches on different controversial issues, found material from websites that were just not credible, and did an entire speech on something that did not exist. So be careful about that. Starting your search with Google. So in a second I'm going to talk about how Google can be a really good resource, but if you just use it as just Googling, typing in your topic and pulling up what you have, that is not going to work. And then using personal websites. So like the cancer example I brought up, don't use those kinds of blogs. Anything that's personal coming from an individual who doesn't have credibility on the topic. So what I want you to think of when you're using any type of source material is that you're a detective. You are going to start finding new things as you research, and this is going to lead you in different ways. So the search and research process should not just be typing in, finding something, that's it. You want to look at the material, and that's going to point you in different directions, and you're going to be finding things and discovering things you may not have even known were going to come up. So how do you do that? So besides what we've already talked about with using the library, you can also use Google. Like I said, it can be good if used correctly. There are 3 different things in Google that you can use that can be very effective in searching. First, Google News, Google Books, and Google Articles. So let me talk about how to use those. So most students start here. They'll type in their topic, and I'm using yoga as an example, and typically they'll just scroll down and kind of click on whatever comes up. Now, what I want you instead to use is a variety of sources. So the first one I mentioned was Google News. So notice what's going to happen is you can pull up a lot of different sources that'll come up and give you different information. And one thing that I also like, how I said you can be a detective. So this article right here from the New Yorker, which is a really great source to use, by the way. If you pull it up, what it's going to talk about is an individual who just passed away couple of weeks ago, and he's actually credited with bringing yoga to the United States. So he's the one that actually made it popular. So I may have just been thinking, okay, I'm going to talk about yoga, maybe its benefits, and then after reading this article I might be inspired to maybe focus on how yoga came to the United States or why it's popular in the United States. So that's what I'm talking about with being a detective. You sometimes have to let the research point you in different directions. You're going to be inspired by different things. The other thing I mentioned that you can use is Google articles. So similar to Google News, you can also look right here at in-depth articles, and these especially are really good. Some of the other articles that I pulled up in the news were more local newspapers, and not that there's anything wrong with local newspapers, but for instance, you'll know New York Times, Vanity Fair, Forbes. Those are really credible national sources, and that's what I want you to look at. So for instance, I think this article right here is really interesting, right? Most of us think of yoga as being something that's really helpful, really healthy, and great for us. And not that I'm saying it's not. However, this article is obviously taking a different approach. So this is something you could offer up in your speech. Now remember, because it's informative, you want to make sure you're not being biased. So you could maybe offer this point of view and another point of view on how it can be helpful for your body, so that you're not taking a particular stance. The last thing you can use is Google Books. So what I want you to do is go right up here to the More tab to use it. You're going to scroll down right here to Books. Now what Google Books does is it's going to give you access to excerpts, sometimes almost all of a book that you can find. So since I typed in yoga, it's popping up all these different books, and I'll scroll down just to show you that there's a lot of books in here. So I'm going to click on this one right here. Now, before you freak out thinking that I'm going to be making you read an entire book, that's not what Google Books is. What it is if you use this search function right here on the side, I can type in a keyword that I'm looking for. So I'll type in breath. What it automatically will do is pinpoint every place that it says that. So for instance, page 12, it has something all about breathing. Automatically it will highlight all the different places on that page, and you can do that for all the pages that pulled up. So what's really great about Google Books is very quickly you can pinpoint the things that you need to use and get really good information without having to go through an entire book, because obviously you're not going to be able to read lots of different books for a speech that you only have 2 weeks basically to prepare for. So remember, using Google News, you just click on the News tab at the top. Google Books, you're going to click on the More tab, scroll down to Books, and in that search function on the left-hand side, you want to type in a specific word, and it will pop up what you need. And the in-depth articles, if you just scroll down, that's typically in the middle of the Google search. So once you've actually found your sources, you also need to cite them. It's important that you cite those things in 2 different ways. First, you will need to verbally cite your sources, meaning in the actual speech you're going to have to tell your audience. And this is something that all speakers will do. If you notice, for instance, in Amy Cuddy's speech, and we're going to be watching a lot of other TED Talks, they will cite their sources. They'll always say according to, or this study found, something that will tell you where it comes from. It makes you more credible. So, first, you can mention the author and the credibility of the author if it's not known. So if it's, say, John Smith, and we don't know who he is in relationship to the topic, you can say John Smith, who is the owner of a scientific lab or is a professor at this university. Just mention so we know why he's credible. Or just mention the source, right? There may not be a specific author. That's also possible, right? If it comes from an organization like the American Cancer Society, you can just mention that as well. Now, the other thing, so I mentioned there's two ways. Verbally cite, you also need a works cited page. So what you can use for a works cited page is a citation generator. The citation generator I recommend is using EasyBib. To get to EasyBib, it's EASYBIB.com. No spaces or anything. So the way you can use EasyBib is earlier I had just pulled up an article from CNN to use as an example. So what I'm going to do is copy and paste the actual address. And this is the article here. I'm going to go back to EasyBib, and you'll see that it has a variety of sources. Since I actually got it online, I'm going to count this as a website. So I'll paste, so this is just the link that I copied a second ago, hit cite it, and what it's going to do is actually search for it to make sure it can find this particular source. So what it's going to do is confirm, right, and I can, check to make sure that all the information is correct. So it says electronically published 1970. I'll have to go back and fix that, but otherwise everything else is correct. So I'll say continue. So here's where if I needed to edit, I could. So I'll go down and just double check the material. Okay, so it says electronically published. That I would need to check. So it was published actually on the same date that basically it was accessed. So I'll just put that same date of September 2nd. Then once I finish that, I can just submit it. So let me fix that. And then go down and hit create citation.
So as you can see, it created that citation. Now there's a couple of different options here. It has all 59. If you click on them, I'm going to use book as an example and type in a book that I'm actually currently reading, if I could spell it correctly. And you'll click cite it and it'll find the book for you. You can do a similar thing with newspapers, journals, databases, those sorts of things. So it's actually going to pull up every book under that title. This is the book currently that I have. So I'll click on this and it's going to pull up that information. So by the way, if you're using Google Books, this is actually what you can do. You could specifically type in the title and then the information will pull up. So then you'll hit create citation, and just like it did for the website, it's going to do a similar thing. The other really good thing is it's actually going to alphabetize it for you. So you'll notice here it already did that. What you can do once you finish, so let's say hypothetically I'm done, I would hit export, print as Word document, and then it's going to take it and put it in the correct format, and then you'll be able to see what it would look like. So once you click on exporting it to MS Word and downloading it, it will pull up this. So automatically I have my works cited page done for me. It's a really good resource. You can do the same thing for journals, websites, all other kinds of documentation. You can type in the title. Sometimes it may not find it, so you might need some other information, and like I showed with the CNN example, you want to double check the information to make sure it's correct. But overall, citation generators like EasyBib are really going to save you a lot of time. I would recommend using them. EasyBib is one of many citation generators, but it's definitely something to look into. So remember, you're going to verbally cite and you need a works cited page. This is what the works cited page is going to look like if you're using MLA. And then remember to actually verbally cite. Just make sure you give us information, right? Who you're talking about or where it's coming from. The specific person, right? Dr. John Fisher, if we don't know who that is, communication professor at Northwest. So keep that in mind. Now I'm going to actually talk about how to balance out your research with non-factual sources. So while research is great, you also want to use other materials to really keep your speech engaging for your audience and really use techniques that make it memorable. So how to do that? There's a couple of different things. When you're developing your speech, you want to keep in mind that there are two different kinds of sources. What I just talked about are factual sources, so the credible pieces of information, statistics, definitions, those sort of things that you're going to pull that will be scholarly or reputable information. And then you have your non-factual sources. So I'm going to talk about what those are. Examples, narratives, testimony, and visual are the major ones that I recommend. Now, sometimes students will ask, well, why are these called non-factual, right? Something like testimony, which is a quote or a narrative, could have actually happened, right? They are fact. I'm just calling them non-factual because they help to break up the monotony of factual material. There's something to balance it out. So when I call it non-factual, doesn't mean it's not true. That's just the way I'm categorizing it. So for non-factual material, there are facts and statistics, but you also want to add to your speech with things like narratives, testimony, which is a quote, narratives is obviously a story, visuals, which can be pictures, videos, or something you pass out, and examples. So let's talk specifically about how to use each of those. So examples and narratives. If you're using an example, basically it's something concrete that the audience can refer to or understand when you're talking about something more complex or abstract. So let me give you an example of an example. Common currency. Right, so when you say this, your audience may not really be able to picture anything, but if you use the euro, then you have something that the audience is more familiar with. So an example is just something specific that you can reference. Another one, if I'm doing a speech on catfishing, right, which is a social media phenomenon, I could use the example of this guy who you may or may not know. This was a couple of years ago, but I think it's Nante Tayo is how his name is pronounced, and he was dating a girl, and it was this great story, and then she ended up dying, which we later found was a complete hoax, and this girl never existed, and he never met her, and she lived far, far away, and they communicated online. And so, of course, it started a trend where people pretended they had girlfriends. They didn't. But both of those would basically work as examples. The next one is narratives, and narratives are especially powerful, right? We're a culture that, as much technology as we use, we really are still very story and narrative based. So these can be really good to represent or demonstrate a concept that's being discussed. So for instance, if you're doing something on bullying, right, you might want to use a story about someone who has been dramatically affected by this, right? This particular story obviously happened at Rutgers University when this student was being taped by his roommate and he hadn't yet come out. Another one, let's say I'm doing a speech on something like genetic markers. Now this is a topic, unlike maybe bullying, that doesn't really connect to the audience as well, right? If you don't have something that relates to genetic markers, you may not care. However, narratives are really effective in bringing the audience in. So I could use the story of Angelina Jolie, who found a genetic marker, the BRCA1 gene, which basically means that you have about an 80% chance of getting cancer, specifically breast or ovarian cancer, and Angelina Jolie had just watched her mother die of breast cancer and having to go through that battle. So using either of these stories would really help not only just to bring the audience in, but to add more character to what you're talking about, to make it more human, more relatable. Now when we talk about narratives, they're not just important for that, but actually to help your audience remember the information. So this is a book, Made to Stick, by two Stanford professors. Now what they did was an experiment in a classroom. They had a bunch of different students give a 1-minute speech, and most students used about 2.5 statistics. Only one of the students actually used a story. Now, when they asked the remembering statistics, aka they asked the audience, well, hey, what did you remember of the speech? You'll notice here, when students are asked to recall the speeches, 63% remember the stories, only 5% remember the individual statistics. So stories are something we remember, they're something that stick. So it's really, really important to utilize them, especially in conjunction with things like statistics or facts, right? This is how your factual and non-factual material really work together. Some other things of non-factual material, testimony. So remember, testimony is just like a quote. You have two different kinds of testimony. The first is expert testimony. This is a quote from someone who's an expert in their field, right? Like a scientist or a researcher. And of course, you want to cite, when you use this quote, who they are and their credibility. So here's an example, according to Dr. Smith, a researcher from the Cato Institute. The other kind of testimony that you can use is lay testimony, and this is going to be testimony from someone who's not an expert, but someone who has personal experience with what's going on, right? Kind of gives you the pulse of a particular group. So you would want to quote the person and basically state how they're relevant, right? How is it that they're affected? So if you're doing, say, a speech on college students and sleeping habits, right? You might want to say, according to Jane Smith, who is a student at Palm Beach State College. To give you an example of how they've been utilized, I'm going to go to that in a second. Right now I'm going to be talking about visuals, which is the last non-factual material source that you can use. So like I said, that can be pictures, that can be videos, that can be a few different things, but it's a really good way of kind of using something when words fail you. So, for instance, I had a student that brought in a bunch of beer cans. She was doing a speech on binge drinking for college students, and she worked at Applebee's and got all of the empty beer bottles, beer cans, everything that she could find, and she laid it on the floor and actually used it as a statistic, saying that this is, you know, what a couple of students in an average night could consume. And it was really powerful. Students remembered that. Now, one thing, you want to make sure that they help your speech rather than distract. So I have a lot of times when students are like, oh, I can use videos or I can use a visual, and they'll just pick a random thing that doesn't really relate or doesn't really help, right? So if you're doing a speech on fitness, this picture would not actually relate to it. You want to use something that's effective. I know people love using pictures of random things and GIFs and cat pictures and all sorts of stuff, but if it doesn't actually help your speech, do not use it. Now, some people will ask, can I use PowerPoint? Yes, you can. However, one thing to note about PowerPoint, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in class, it's really important that you don't read off your PowerPoint. PowerPoint can be a great aid, or you could also use Prezi, which is what I use, if it's something that's in the background and it doesn't lead your presentation. But if you put your entire speech on the PowerPoint and read off of it the most of the time, it is not going to be something that's helpful. So tread lightly with PowerPoint. If you know how to use it and you have experience, then I would recommend using it. If you've never used it before, then maybe for this speech you might not want to, and maybe for the next one you could try and experiment with it. Now, I said I was going to give you some examples. Let's say you were doing a speech on Hurricane Katrina. If you had lay testimony, and this is an actual quote from a story that I heard recently on NPR when they were going back and talking about some of the reactions and how people are rebuilding. This was a mother they interviewed, and she said, I wasn't worried about my things. It was the kids, losing the kids stuff. That really got to me, and I thought that was a really powerful quote. And then, of course, a visual using an actual picture, right? Sometimes that devastation, you can give statistics, but they're really not effective in showing what actually has happened. Alright, so that is it for homework. Now, you're going to have to answer a couple of questions, and there's one other thing you're going to have to do. So here are the questions. Name the citation generator that was recommended. That should be relatively easy. Where can you find scholarly sources? What makes a source current? Why is the Brady campaign a bad source? How is research like detective work? Name one specific example of a non-factual source. So you will answer those questions. In addition, so this is the second thing you have to do, come in with two sources that you can find that are either scholarly or reputable. Now, you don't have to print them. I know that takes a lot of time and money. So if you want to bring some sort of digital copy on a tablet or on your phone or your laptop, because actually this class will need laptops. We will actually be doing something on a laptop. So if you have a tablet or laptop that you can bring in, please do so. If you don't, that's okay. We're going to be doing something in a group, but the more laptops and tablets that you have access to, the better. So please bring that in, answer the questions, and have your source.